G'day there. When I share an image on one of my videos, I also share the camera settings that I use when I took the shot. I do this because those of you who are learning about landscape photography or want to improve your landscape photography can get a better understanding of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. But I've never really gone over generally what settings I use when I'm taking my landscape images, what settings I think are important, what settings I don't really care about. So that's what we're going to cover this week. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, so if you need a website, a domain or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace and use the discount code AndrewMarr. Now, it doesn't matter what make or model of camera that you use. I try and use these settings on any camera that I use for landscapes. For this video, I'm going to use the Fuji X-T3, which I love taking landscapes with when I go out on a hike. Plus, they've got these beautiful dials that make it really easy to demonstrate. So first, we're going to look at how I set the camera up before I go out on a shoot, and then we'll look at the settings that I use as I'm taking a shot. When it comes to landscape photography, I want the image to be captured at the highest quality, as large as I can, with the most amount of detail. So I shoot all of my images in RAW. If I know it's going to be handy to have a JPEG version quickly straight out of camera, say for posting on social media, then I'll shoot in both RAW and JPEG. So regardless, I'll always have a RAW version. Shooting in RAW allows me to capture the greatest dynamic range, plus provides me with the greatest amount of flexibility when I'm editing the image in post. I'll also select the largest size and the crop ratio that matches the native crop of the lens. So for the X-T3, that's 3:2. This way I'm maximizing all of the pixels on the sensor to capture the detail of the image I'm photographing. So I have the most amount of information when I'm editing the image. Now, I've covered the importance of editing your landscape images in a previous video, which I'll link in the description below. For white balance, I prefer to have the camera set to auto. As I just mentioned, I shoot everything in RAW, which captures the greatest amount of color, detail, and dynamic range. I don't really care what the white balance is because I can adjust it in post. I leave it on auto because I prefer to determine exactly what the white balance is as part of my editing process once I see the image on the computer. When on location, I often use the EVF to initially compose the image. However, I tend to use the LCD on the back of the camera to monitor the scene as I'm taking the shot. So to help with this, I set the screen up with information to help make it easier for me. I have the exposure indicator displayed and I have the metering mode set to average. In this mode, the camera averages the light out across the scene and gives me a value shown in the exposure indicator. More importantly though, I also have my histogram displayed on the LCD screen as well. From the histogram, I can check the tonal values across the entire scene and ensure that I'm not clipping any highlights or shadows, plus monitor if my image is generally too dark or too light. I find the histogram far more helpful than just the exposure indicator on its own. Something else that I like to set up on every camera that I use is back button focusing. I do this because it's a quick way of stopping the camera trying to automatically focus whenever you press the shutter button. It's also a seamless way of moving between autofocus and manual focus whenever you need to. And once you're used to it, I find that back button focusing is a more intuitive way of focusing the camera. I've actually done a video on the advantages of back button focusing and how to set it up that I'll link in the description below. The other thing I like to do is set up a button or a dial that I use to punch in 100% on the LCD screen so I can quickly check my focus before I take a shot. I have the focus set to single point and dial it down to either the smallest or one up from the smallest so I can accurately pinpoint the exact spot in the scene I want the camera to focus on. With this setup, I position the point where I want to focus. In most cases, it's roughly a third of the way into the scene on a part of the image that has some contrast, so it's easy for the camera to focus on. I hit the back button focus to autofocus the scene. I then press the back dial that I've set up to zoom in 100% and check the focus. I either then press the back button again to refocus if I need to, or manually adjust the focus by using the focus ring on the lens. I shoot in manual mode pretty much all the time. I know that there are plenty of photographers out there that shoot in aperture priority or even shutter priority when they're shooting landscapes, but I just prefer the control that I have in manual mode. I'll probably make a video in the future about why I like to shoot my landscapes in manual mode. But the quick version is I don't want the camera to decide how the image is going to be exposed, particularly if the scene is changing with the light or there are things moving like waves that can quickly change the tonal values of a scene. Plus, I have all the information that I need to expose the image correctly using the histogram as well as the other information that I have displayed on the back screen. Manual mode just is better for me because it suits the way that I think. Now, I'm after the best image quality, so I'll select the base ISO for the camera. For the TX3, that's 160. You should check out what the base ISO is on your camera and try and stick to that. There are situations where I'll increase the ISO a little. This is usually because I want to set the aperture or the shutter speed at a specific value for an effect I'm trying to achieve, and there is a low amount of light. Increasing the ISO a little will help, but be careful. The more you increase the ISO, the more noise you'll introduce into your image. The maximum I'll typically go to is somewhere between 400 and 500, unless I'm doing astrophotography, where I'll go as high as 1600 or 3200. After I've decided on the ISO, depending on the scene that I'm shooting, I'll either set the aperture or the shutter speed next. Aperture is referring to the aperture inside the lens and how wide it gets when you take the shot. Not only does it impact the amount of light that comes through and hits the sensor, but it also affects the amount of the scene that is in focus, or the depth of field. If everything in the scene is a similar distance from the camera, you can get away with a wide aperture which has a short depth of field. That's why I can shoot many of my drone shots when I've got the camera pointed straight down to the ground with a wide aperture of f5.6 or even wider. Typically for traditional landscapes though, there are elements within the scene that are various distances from the camera. I'll dial in a small aperture which gives me a large depth of field. That way more of the elements in the scene are in focus. Generally I'll select an aperture somewhere between f11 and f16. Much above f16 and you start to introduce diffraction, which results in a slight blurring effect caused by the light as it passes through the small aperture. When I'm shooting a scene where there is something moving, I'll decide on my shutter speed first before my aperture. A quick shutter speed like 1/100th of a second or quicker will freeze anything moving in the shot. A longer shutter speed like 1/4 of a second or slower will capture the movement of any moving object. So for scenes like seascapes and waterfalls, I'll set a shutter speed of around 1/3 to 2/3 of a second, depending on how fast the waves or the water is moving. I like the effect that this creates in the final image. When I'm shooting a scene with trees or leaves and there is some wind blowing the branches around, I'll select a quicker shutter speed so I can freeze any motion that's occurring. I'm going to finish off with some of the accessories that I use when I take my landscape images, but first I just wanted to quickly thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Squarespace is an all-in-one website building platform that allows you to quickly set up and host your own website. If you're thinking about creating your own web gallery to showcase your images, it's really simple to do this through a Squarespace site. First, you browse through their range of beautiful templates and select one that you like. Some of these templates have been designed just with photographers in mind. From there, you add a template, decide on a layout that suits you, and then you add your images. It's really that simple. From there, you can customize the page with your own style. Over time, you can add other features like integration to social media accounts, a blog to document your photography journey, and an about page with a contact form so brands can reach out and start working with you. As you grow as a photographer, a Squarespace site can grow with you. You can start your free trial at squarespace.com, where you can check out all the templates and start building pages, no credit card needed. And if you do check them out and you want to go ahead with a website, make sure you go to squarespace.com/Andrew Marr to get 10% off your first purchase. There are a few features of the camera and some accessories that I add when I'm shooting my landscape images that I just want to mention. First is the LCD screen on the back. As I mentioned before, I use it to check my composition and my focus. To help with composition, I'll sometimes add a 9-cell grid across the display to show where the vertical and horizontal thirds are as a bit of a guide. I'll also use the LCD to monitor my exposure using the live histogram that I've set up to display before I take a shot. I can see the exposure settings at a glance down the bottom of the screen, and the fact that the screen can tilt makes it really easy to view this information and the image that I'm about to take, regardless of what angle I've got the camera positioned, particularly if it's low to the ground. I'll use a shutter release cable like this to trigger the shutter if I want to avoid touching the camera to take the shot and minimize camera shake. If the scene is very simple and there's not much moving around, I'll sometimes use the self timer on the camera, usually set to about 2 seconds, to automatically take the shot. However, when I want to be more precise about when a shot is taken, like in a scene where I have a wave crashing over some rocks, I'm not able to accurately time the shot with a 2-second shutter delay. That's why I prefer to use a cable shutter. I use a cheap generic brand so that if it breaks or I drop it in the water, it can easily be replaced. I think I bought this one from eBay. I found that the wireless ones can sometimes lose connection, which can be frustrating, and they're a lot more expensive. Plus the cabled ones don't have a battery that needs recharging or replacing. I also use a range of filters on my lenses when I'm taking my landscape images, from polarizers to neutral densities to graduated filters. And I use a selection of these filters depending on the scene that I'm capturing, the amount of light that's available, and the effect that I'm trying to create as well. I've actually done a video on all the filters that I use and why I use them. I'll link it in the description below. One filter that I do always have on my lens when I'm taking landscape images is my polarizer. And the reason for that is that the effect that it has on the images, which is cutting out glare from wet surfaces, can't be replicated in post-processing. So that's pretty much it. Remember, I'm not telling you how you have to set up your camera and you have to use these settings, but after 25 years of shooting landscape images, these are the settings that I use most of the time to capture my landscape images. Each scene is different and requires different settings. If you're familiar with some of my other videos, you'll know that I like to take you with me out on location where I talk through why I choose the settings that I use for a particular shot. So if you're new to the channel and you're interested in knowing a little bit more about how I capture my landscape images, check out some of those landscape photography adventure videos. If there are any settings that you think I might have missed, please let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you. If you have any friends that are interested in landscape photography, please share this video with them if you think they might find it helpful. All of these settings at once can seem a little bit daunting, but the more you practice, the better you get at developing your workflow when you're out in the field. And selecting the best settings for the image that you're trying to capture becomes easier and easier the more you practice. On that point, I hope you're finding time to get out there and do some landscape photography. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.